Okay. Uh, Welcome everyone to episode 4 of Read Write, our bi-weekly book club podcast. With me today, and as always, of course, I am Sam, aka MC Pepper Pockets,
This
and with
is
me today is Brendan. He's gonna cut in.
Yep, I'm cutting in. This is Brendan, aka Cosmic Zord, aka Accidental Origin. And our guest host, continuing on from our discussion last week, is my good friend Lucas.
Oh, just Lucas. That's all.
Yeah.
I got no other AKAs. I'm a simple boy, you know.
Yep. So, before we start with the book, Sam, just wanted to talk a little bit about that awesome thing the viewers just saw.
Oh, you mean our beautiful intro and the fantastic piece of music that our friend Steph made for us?
Yes, indeed. That is exactly what I was talking about. So shout outs to our good friend Stefan Jurovitsky, and I probably butchered that. And Luke Finch, who did all the animations for us. So yeah,
Yep.
let's
Thank you,
get the
Stephen
show on
Finch.
the road.
Okay, so last week we read the first 6 chapters of the Dispossessed, and it was 3 weeks because of Easter. We read the final 7 chapters, although the last chapter was really short.
Yeah, it was real short.
It was extremely short. So I guess
Funnily
we should
enough,
probably.
weird observation, but funnily enough, I actually think those 6 pages of like that last chapter were the difference between having it be exactly half in the first part.
Do you think so? Yeah,
Yeah.
that actually makes sense.
Because it was like real close.
Yeah. And it was interesting, in my opinion, how important those last 6 chapters, or pages, I mean, were.
Yeah, I would say like the last 3 pages more than the last 6, but yeah.
But just that last chapter kind of was the capstone.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Definitely.
Okay, so I guess we kind of want to go over a really quick summary of the events that took place during this second half of the book, because a fair bit more happened here than in the first half, I think.
Maybe it depends on what you mean by things happening, I guess.
Yeah, I agree, because I think philosophically there was more things happening, like in
Yes.
terms of changes philosophically, but in terms of action, I'm not entirely sure there was.
Okay,
Do we want to
mean-
quickly go over what happens in the second half?
yeah, just real quick.
Yeah.
Okay. I'll do this as quick as I can. So we've got Shevek. We start off with the future Shevek, and I'll do future Shevek first, and then do back Shevek. So Shevek, future Shevek, or present Shevek, he goes, meets this woman called Via, which is the sister of Oli, a guy we met in the first half. And long story short, they meet up in the city of Neo-Essia, and he goes to Vey's house for a party. He gets super drunk at her party and talks like philosophically with some people at the party, and then there's a like sexual assault rape scene at the end when he gets drunk, and then he gets brought home by Pei. You also learn in this chapter that local, is it a country or a city of Ben Billy, like there's a revolution that's starting up there.
It's a country.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a much smaller country.
Yeah. So after that all happens, skip past a chapter, and Shevek is now confined to the university like plaza because of the war that's going on between now the the Iotas and the Ben Billies. Shevek finally finishes his general principles theorem, and promptly escapes the university to Neo Essa to basically meet up with revolutionaries. The revolutionaries have a demonstration. It gets snuffed by the police of AIO, and more or less Shevek escapes the city. After that, basically Shevek escapes to what's called a Terran, basically the people of Earth's embassy that now lives on Eurus. He gives out his theory to everyone and then hitches a ride back to Anaris. Clearly, we're going over a lot of stuff, but this is more or less what happens. Now you go back to past Shevek. You see him complete his first manuscript, The Principles of Simultaneity, but has trouble publishing them and has to publish them under Saddle's name with a bastardized version. He has a baby with Takver, and they decide to partner up. And due to a drought that happened on Anaris, you've got Takver and Shevek being separated for 4 years. Basically, the next chapter after that is that Takver and Shevek reunite, and then the final chapter of Past Shevek, you see him and his friend BDAP make the Syndicate of Initiative on Anaris, doing 3 main things: contacting Eurus via radio signal, printing Shevek's and other people's work without the restrictions of the PDC. Can't remember what that initializes from, and then basically wanting to send someone to Eurus, which funnily enough happens to be Shevek in the end. Is there anything that I missed? Obviously we missed all of the philosophical things that go on within that, but that's more or less what happens within the book.
Yeah, I think that's a fairly robust plot summary.
Yeah.
So now let's get to the important things of exactly what those things kind of brought out philosophically within the book, and kind of the discussions that come from all the things that happen.
Yeah. So, what do you guys want to talk about first? I have a whole list of things that I wanted to bring up.
I mean, sorry, go ahead, Sam.
I was going to say that whole scene at the beginning where he goes and he gets drunk for the first time, it feels like it feeds back into him getting acclimated to Eurus, where now he's literally taking their poison into his body.
Right.
Interesting. Yeah, I could see that. That was an interesting moment for me because it was very much a... he's like, oh, I see all these people drinking this stuff and it doesn't bother them. Why would it bother me? And he drinks it and he's like, yeah, this does nothing. And he just keeps drinking. It's like, you all remember our first time drinking alcohol, where, you don't realize how it affects you until you actually do it, sort of thing, right? So he's kind of like
Absolutely.
a babe in the fold almost, right? So I thought that was interesting. The one thing that I really took out of that scene, apart from all the philosophy, which I thought was really interesting, but that, do we think Vey is an agent? Same as Pei?
Oh,
I
goodness.
think that's a tough one.
My guess would be no, and I think it's because specifically she's a woman.
Interesting.
And how they set up women in the society.
Right. Yeah, I could see that, but it's really interesting because when Pei picks him up, she says, "Say hello to the chief for me."
Oh, does he say that to?
Well, no, she says it to him.
Okay, I missed that.
Yeah, just when they're unloading him, after he's really drunk, taking him back to the apartment.
Yeah.
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 Yeah,
So
I
That's a
noticed that too.
possibility. Hmm.
I was just I don't have an answer. I just thought it was interesting. Like it was all. The reason I ask is because it seems to me like she was definitely trying to entice him. Right.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Like she was trying. She's like, "Oh, my husband's always away. I think you're cute and funny. Like, come hang out with me." So I wonder if she was kind of like if since Pei was getting nowhere, if she was kind of like the honey to the stick sort of thing, right? To get the
Oh
work
yeah,
from him.
I mean, it was a classic honeypot trap.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, in the Cold War, there were tons of instances of that happening where, the Soviet Union or the United States would set up some pretty secretary for this person they knew was a spy.
Hmm.
So eventually they'd get close enough and just spill the beans, which is pretty much what he did here. Except, he had so much spaghetti coming out of his pockets, he couldn't really handle it.
But did he spill like the beans, which was basically he hadn't completed his general theorem yet? Like they found that out from dropping him off at his place. But like was that just coincidence? Like they could have just gone into his place whenever they wanted to.
Well, I think they do that as well,
Yeah.
but he kind of fess up that he did come there to change minds at least a little bit,
Right, okay.
rather than it just being purely a academic exercise.
Hmm.
Yeah. I get the impression that he does that on a regular basis, and we just kind of finally see his frustration at not finding anything those times.
Right. That makes sense.
Sort of thing where he's just like, ugh, there's still nothing here. Why is there never anything here?
And to me, that like this chapter, I found the party was a little bit bland. Not bland. Like you clearly have the interaction between Shevek and the other guests about like his theories, but I feel like we've seen that kind of side of him before. What I was really interested was his interactions with Vey before the party. I think a lot of interesting philosophical things that kind of tie in with the overall arching theme of the book come in. Like specifically the stuff about time. He says something really interesting near the end of their encounter before the party. And he says something like, "The seeing the difference between now and not now, we can make the connection. And there is a morality enters, responsibility. To say that a good end will follow from a bad mean is just like saying that if I pull a rope on a pulley, it will lift the weight on that one. To break a promise is to deny the reality of the past. Therefore, it is to deny the hope of a real future." I think this ties in a lot with like the philosophy of Aneris and his also philosophy of how he sees time and how he also doesn't necessarily think of time as a now, but more of a every time.
So sorry, Sam.
Go ahead.
I have this pocket theory about how this book is constructed. And I think the further along in the book you go, the more frequent the references to time are.
Oh, definitely.
Right? So it's kind of
Think
like
so.
almost this weird, like as the book builds in its philosophical climax, you get more and more references to how he refers to time.
Mm-hmm. And I think that also goes along with his getting closer to finishing the theory. Like, basically, as he gets closer and closer to actually doing it, that's when the philosophical side of him talking with other people gets more and more dramatic or more like eloquent almost. He seems very stiff in his thoughts at the beginning of the book, and as the book tends to evolve, so does his like thoughts and theories of time.
Yeah, and you know what that is? Like, to me, that's kind of the way that I write. It's like this sort of distilling of a bunch of different things, and it's you're seeing the entire process of that, where he starts out with this general concept and he's like, no, but that doesn't really work, so I need to do something else. And it's like, well, that doesn't really work, so I need to do something else. And he realizes like what elements of each he needs to make it a whole.
Yeah, he slowly carves away all the excess that he doesn't need
Yeah.
until eventually he just has that core theory.
Yeah.
And I feel like that kind of happens or is parallel to his life. And maybe that's the point, like in the background component of the story where the famine hits and he has to take all these kind of semi-random jobs just out in the wilderness.
Yep. I mean, I was totally hoping that he was the weird truck driver
Oh, and not the passenger.
and not the passenger.
Yeah.
Oh, that would be hilarious.
Because I just...
So
Sorry, go ahead.
sorry,
Luke.
go ahead. I want to let you finish your thought.
Well, I was just like, I really like the idea of him being kind of that kind of thing where, you know, he made this sort of personal isolation so he could work on his theories in his truck while traveling to see Takvar, but obviously that wasn't the case. But
Right.
that's just, I kind of wanted that for him.
See, I want to get your guys' opinions on that specific scene there, and because it's a different scene from every other scene in the entire book, because
That's true.
the author is describing Shevek in the third person, like without saying his name, and you have to infer that Shevek. And
I
was
think
just
the only
wondering-
time that happens is the very beginning.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, before you even know who the character is.
Yeah, exactly.
I was going to say the first 2 chapters is where they really do that.
Right, because I don't think they even say his name until chapter 2.
Yeah, but chapter 2, they have to start in third person because as a baby, they couldn't describe it from his perspective, but that rapidly changes.
Yeah. So what I was saying is that this is a big transition from basically what the last, what was it, 6 or 7 chapters were.
That's true.
And, like, do you think that the author was trying to pull any sort of focus on this scene? Like, why the choice of not using Shevek's name in this, and like kind of keeping you guessing on exactly what's going on?
I don't know. I hadn't really thought
Any
about
theories?
it, but it did feel very out of place because they never really resolve it as a scene.
Well, I thought it was a way of showing how Shevek is not alone. Or he's not alone in his isolation.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
Mhm.
I see.
Like
what you're
there's
saying.
other people who've tried to achieve what he's trying to achieve, and they've figured out kind of an accommodation.
Right, I get what you're saying. I got that impression in a sense because I felt like, again, because I feel this narrative is very much like Ursula K. Le Guin's kind of theories on the world and her past experiences. I got that impression of like this was kind of her justifying monogamy in a way.
It was
Ooh.
kind of, or it felt like a kind of argument to its irrefutability. Like even in this society where everything's discarded, that still happens.
Yeah. Yeah. So like that's the impression I got from that scene was it was kind of like a thought process proof of the practice of monogamy within this society.
That's an interesting thought too. I like both of those things. I really couldn't get a grasp on what that was all about, but that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, it was weird. Cuz
Well, I
it was
thought this was
extremely different.
It was different, but I thought it was weird because it's something that happens like now. That's a ongoing thing. The long haul trucker or even relatively short haul truckers, they spend even in the short term like 36 hours on the road, so they're gone for 2 days, call it.
Yeah.
On the short end, and then it's like maybe you're away for months if you're on a some sort of cargo ship. So
Right.
it was like the way that their society, even though it's so alien, still has these same positions of like, oh yeah, truck driver, uh, ship captain, train director.
Yeah, I mean, my uncle is a truck driver, or used to be. He's retired now. But yeah, he used to truck from Ireland all the way across Europe for like a week, sort of thing, and then come back. He eventually took a job driving an airport route. So he used to drive baggage deliveries to like the airport and back, sort of thing, so that he could be home every night. You know what I mean? Like that's what it was. It was really interesting.
Well, you know what was the expression at the beginning of the book? True journey is return.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's what this book is about.
And really, I think that could have been, like, a lot of people put the unofficial subtitle as The Ambitious Utopia.
Yeah, the ambiguous
like-
utopia.
I feel like that could have been the second subtitle of the book, because really that's the main theme of the book, right? Is the circle and ending where you begin.
Yeah, it's very much that type of book, and I wanted to bring it up because you asked before we started the show, which one of us, like, were any of us right in our predictions? And I think
wasn't.
I think technically we all were.
Well, remind me what I predicted, because I can't really remember.
So Lucas said Odo version 2.0. Sam said break down the wall. And I said return to Aneris. So I was definitely correct.
Well,
Yes, you were the most correct.
But I think you were also very correct, Sam, in that I think he did break down a wall. It wasn't the physical wall. He didn't like open up the spaceport for everyone, but he broke down a wall to open up Aneris.
Yeah, and he kind of poked a couple holes in it rather so much than breaking it down.
Yeah. Because it's a process. It wasn't like he was just gonna get there and just destroy it. There's things that need to change socially for that to be able to happen. And I think Lucas was also correct in his Odo version 2.0, because I think a lot of that scene with the riot was exactly that.
Right, but later on in the book they said basically the riot was quelled, and like basically the second revolution on Eurus was stopped. Really, I think what like Odo 2.0 was Aneris, because you see in the chapter right before he comes back, the Syndicate of Initiation is basically the re-revolution of Aneris.
Right.
The return of anarchy to Aneris.
Yeah, and they had this very complex thought process when they were in that meeting with the PDC, where they were saying, you know, like, if you're not constantly in a revolution, you're not doing it right. Like this idea of like continual self-improvement, continual evolution, continual revolution.
Yeah, that's actually a pretty major factor in a lot of socialist thinking, is that you have this concept of perpetual revolution. Because it's kind of an acknowledgement that in every revolution, or at least every revolution so far, it's usually just a changing places of classes. So
yeah,
in like a socialist revolution on Earth, at least, what we've seen is the replacement of the aristocracy or of the bourgeois like classes by the working class, who then themselves become enriched by the system and entrenched and invested and replace the aristocracy as a new proto-aristocracy. And then you have another revolution that bumps them off, and the people at the bottom go back up to the top, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
And so the idea of perpetual revolution is that you keep cycling through before the top part can kind of settle in and get and gain a lot of power. Even the way the PDC did and the way the the bureau responsible for distributing jobs
Mm-hmm. The Div
becomes Div Lab.
Yeah.
The way both of those things have so much influence over everyone's individual lives that they've effectively become a government and bureaucracy.
And it's weird, like going along with that, because people are always saying that you're free, and if I can find the line before we go on, basically, Shevik is saying we're free to go everywhere, but we're stifled by this obedience we feel to society.
Yeah.
If I can find the line, I'll bring it up. I highlighted.
Is that the one where he's talking about how they're free to do anything, but not free from anything?
Possibly. That sounds very familiar.
Well, I think in this second section, he really addresses that concept twice. He addresses it once earlier on, and I can't remember exactly where he addresses it, but he addresses it again when he meets up with Takvar for the second time, like after they've been apart for a bunch of years. Because he literally says that to her. He's just like,
here, I think I've got it right here. Exactly what you're talking about. He says that we're all ashamed to say we refuse a posting. That the social conscience completely dominates the individual conscience. Instead of striking a balance with it, we don't cooperate, we obey. We fear being outcast by being called lazy, dysfunctional, or egoizing.
Yeah, and Bedap brings that back up when they're talking to the PDC in their meeting, where he was saying, oh God, what was he saying there? He was saying that if you force us, or you if you refuse us, you're basically becoming a government. You're becoming a law, and you can't do that. So you can't actually like stop us from doing this. Like that's basically the gist of what he said, right? That's the
and
idea.
they kind of concede that point.
They do.
Sort of.
Well, they don't until that old man starts giving them the Odo scripture, right?
Yeah. Well, but even though they grant permission nominally, or at least they say they're not going to obstruct, they still obstruct, like behind the scenes, all the politicking that they're told doesn't exist.
Right. Yeah. I really liked how Le Guin changed like the PDC over the course of that drought, and how their structure sort of changed internally, like their politics changed, even though they don't have politics. Right?
Yeah, well, because they had to, for a brief time, take up a bunch of power, and then when it came time for them to relinquish that power, they were unwilling.
Yeah.
Because everything runs so much better under our system with me in charge.
Exactly, right?
Was basically their argument.
Yeah.
And I think there's a good point that you see a lot online about the book and about kind of utopian books around this time that are kind of the better books that came out, is that the good books about utopias are talking about non-perfect utopias, where they're trying to show the ideals by also showing the flaws and saying, here's a kind of realistic view of what might happen, but it's also saying, like, it's clearly not going to be perfect. Here are the flaws, but here are the great things that come out of that as well.
Yeah, when I hosted another science fiction writers podcast one time after one of my streams by a guy named Zach Ziz, who's a sci-fi writer, and they were specifically talking about dystopias. But the way that they were discussing it was really interesting to me, and I think it plays into kind of what you were saying, Lucas, is that one man's utopia is another man's dystopia.
Mm-hmm.
which is very much what this book is kind of about.
And from what I've read about this book is that it didn't start out like that. Like Le Guin's initial thought of how people were going to receive this book wasn't going to be that kind of people are going to see this as a side of dystopia. I think she was writing to show the benefits of, like, I guess what I would call, and correct me if I'm wrong, kind of like pure socialism.
Yeah, as pure as you can get in practice.
Yeah.
Gosh, I completely just lost my thought. It's gone.
Well, you said it started as that and then ended as...
Right. But now people are seeing it as, like, basically it's a comparison between kind of contemporary American society and socialism. And some people are seeing the socialism side of that, who knows, whatever aspect they grasp onto as something as non-ideal.
Yeah, I mean, this book...
And apparently Le Guin didn't anticipate that kind of reaction to the book.
I mean, thinking about it now, it is interesting because this book was published in 1974, which means it was being written a little bit before that. But if you think about it, I mean, that means that Le Guin would, like, you know, live through the McCarthy era. She lived through that sort of anti-red, like, tribunals, imprisonment, blacklisting. I mean, I know about it specifically more in terms of the entertainment industry than anything else, because again, that's my forte. But yeah, there was a ton of that going on in the 50s, right? Like, just sheer persecution of socialism, specifically communism, but like socialism as a part of communism.
What's interesting about that is you see that McCarthyist kind of sentiment way more in the anarchistic society than in the Eurist society.
Yeah.
Because it's people getting, like Shevek, for example, getting blackballed for having unconventional views, in his case on physics, because that's not the accepted party line.
Mm-hmm. Yep. It's almost like an inversion of it, right?
Well, it's the exact same as it. It's just anyone defending their particular dogma because it gets entrenched sufficiently, and their identity is so completely bound up in that ideology that to have it diminished is to diminish themselves.
Right.
And to the extent that even it's Shevek's mother who argues against him most vehemently because she's so completely committed to Odinism.
She's such a great character. I really like her. Like, a lot. Yeah, I agree. I agree entirely. And I mean, like, we've talked about, I know we talked about ad nauseum last time about, like, the historical, just gonna adjust my camera there, the historical parallels of our world events that have gone on in this book. I thought there were a few more. I kind of felt like that riot was based on something, as well as the Benville Revolution. And then there was one other one that I really want to get into, but we'll talk about that afterwards. But yeah, the riots I got, Vietnam references. The riots I got a big feel of, like, a lot of the stuff that went down when the Republic of Ireland was being formed.
Yeah.
You know, that sort of how far are we going to go, and then mass demonstrations, and then you're having a mass demonstration at a sports stadium and a tank breaks through the wall and kills everybody. Like, that stuff happened. So but that's quite a few years older than, like, that would have happened before Le Guin was born. But I got that, personally, those are the parallels I got.
What about you, Sam? I was just gonna prompt you to give you the rest of your history knowledge to slam it down.
Well, I was gonna say this reminds me of well, a lot of different instances of protests against military action, and you can see it on two different sides, two opposite sides potentially. It's every time hippies protested against the Vietnam War, they're spiking guns with flowers and stuff like that, and that's how this starts. Except then soldiers start firing into the crowd, as has happened in the United States during that 60s and 70s time period. But then you can see it on the opposite side in the demonstrations in Tiananmen Square,
Right.
in China, where it's people protesting for democracy against their autocratic and nominally communist government. And each got similar kind of coverage where there's a burst of media concern, and then it really dies down quickly as whether it be the American or the Chinese government try and suppress it as much as possible because they know it's such a flashpoint. But overall, I thought the war in Ben Billy and its fallout was very much just like Vietnam. It was meant to be a ideological proxy war.
Yeah, definitely. Because it was between the Ionians and the Thun.
Yeah.
Right? Like these two opposing countries, and even at one point, he asks his friend there, like, why are they doing this? And he's like, well, they wouldn't fight. We can't invade each other. That would just be too terrible and would cost too many lives and be too hard. So we'll just have this war outside the country.
Well, outside civilized countries.
Right, that's what he says. Civilized countries.
We're too civilized to fight in good territory. We're just gonna mess up these third country nerds.
Yeah, I mean
Vietnam.
Yeah, totally.
Well, and that same instance also, and one of the scenes where Shevek's talking to one of the older physicist whose name I can't remember.
Atro?
Alto, yeah, who's a devout militarist and nationalist. And Shevek talks about the conscripts going. He's like, well, why do they go? And Alt doesn't care at all. He's like, what do you mean, why do they go? Who cares? We scoop them up, they go, they fight and die. It's great.
Yeah, well, basically because that's their job, right?
Yeah, I was gonna say they kind of, a lot of people define that as like that's their purpose, period, to go and be a body in their innumerable wars.
Yeah, because that's their class. They work and fight and die.
So the thing that I thought was really interesting about that entire section, between the riot and that, is I got such a really cool 1984 vibe from all of that. And I think that's because 1984, again, is that dystopia showing you these kind of things in the same way that they are, right? It's that weirdness. And I mean, that's what 1984 does, right? Yeah, the proletarians are conscripted to fight these wars at who knows where because that's what the government wants.
Yeah, I also think it's similar because 1984 is a very kind of urban dystopia. It takes place almost entirely within downtown London, I think.
Yeah, basically.
Where a lot of it starts in that more pastoral kind of environment where Shevek lives, and then moves inward as the revolution kind of peaks towards the central, more densely populated and dirtier parts of Neo-Io, or whatever the capital city is called.
Neo-Essia.
Neo-Essia, right.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree with that. It's that urban dystopia.
And to kind of go off the same thing of that, I think this is another example of like Le Guin kind of setting. So in the kind of first half of the book, she sets up the kind of standard places you'll be, and it's basically Albany and the university, like scenes, and you you more or less don't see anything else other than those two places in the first half of the book. And then the second half of the book is more or less breaking all of those locations and saying, okay, now let's compare the first half of kind of what you see as the kind of perfect side of Aneris, perfect, and the like rich side of Eurus, and now let's flip both of those on their head.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it was a deconstruction of both those different places, which he thought each was perfect at a certain time of his life before he experienced some particular event that really shook him out of that mindset.
Which, again, because this is what this book does, just goes full circle, and he describes all of those events as being something he needed to experience in order to finish creating his theory.
Yeah, it seems like the time and place informs a lot of how he views time and place. As strange as that seems.
Right.
But isn't that human experience?
Yeah, maybe that's what the author was going for, is that so much is just informed by your particular sensory input at any given moment.
Yeah. But it's also like how we build upon what we did before and where we think we're going.
So do you see that as a refutation of his simultaneity?
No,
Because,
I don't.
so I thought his metaphor, I guess, for simultaneity was really interesting, because for me it kind of explained it in one line, because it was such a meta explanation, I thought. Do you guys remember what it was?
I do not.
He was in the park with
Was
Via.
it where he was describing time as a book?
Yeah.
Because I wrote
I don't
down
remember this.
I wrote it down how meta that was on my list here.
Yeah, it was fantastic, because they're talking about, well, how can time be all at the same time? Like, one thing happens after another, and some things are before and after, and we can see that for sure. He's like, okay, well, imagine reading a novel or reading a book, right? Like, to you, your experience of it all happens in order. But when you look at that book from the side, all those pages exist at the same time. So, he's saying all the events of history and time exist. We're just kind of paging through them.
That metaphor is even better when you consider that the literal book that you're reading while he says that is out of chronological order.
Yeah. It's pretty good.
Right? Like
That's pretty
it like purposefully flips back and forth between two different chronologies, and we know that all of them happen. We know that at the beginning all of this other stuff had to have happened for him to get there. But we don't know what those are or how they happen.
Oh, and you know what's really weird? Because I'm just looking at my notes here. In chapter 8, when Chev can't get his new treatise published, and he's talking to Tekver about it, she says, like, you'll be able to live if this doesn't get published, and he says, I am that book.
Yeah.
So, like, this book imagery of it being all preordained and pre-written and pre-structured is kind of more present than you'd think.
Mm-hmm. And he had to write that book in order to come to the realization of how the other theory would work.
And
Yeah,
I think
and you know what? Even his first book that he publishes on Aneres under Sable's name, but on Eurus under his own name when he smuggles it out, he has these two simultaneous versions of the same theory that kind of stand like pages next to each other.
Yeah.
Yeah, Le Guin does a great job of kind of throwing the metaphors beside each other throughout the book. And I realized that the amount of times that Shevek kind of finishes a theory and then goes on to the next one really fulfills the idea of the circular motion of once something ends, the next thing begins, and how like the three theories of the entire book are, okay, I've done this one, it's time to go on to the next one. And he talks about a little bit later on, and talks about here it is. It's not a journey and return, but a closed cycle, a locked room, a cell. And I think that's an interesting metaphor for the book of how him trying to finish his theory, he describes almost as if being trapped until like this theory kind of comes out of his head, or he finds whatever lock, and in the end the lock was kind of this Terran theory of relativity that opens the key to the general theory that he's been trying to write this whole time.
You know what's even better about that? Is that he writes the theory in a literal locked room.
Mm-hmm. And he writes it in a code that at one time he forgets how to decode.
Yeah. Oh man.
So which is so interesting too, because he does all of this even though he's coming from Anaris, which has none of these things. He's embracing like the proprietarian philosophies of locked doors and keys to try and spread a revolution on Eurus. It's like he can't use the things that are like what would you call them? Like the keystones of his society on Anaris to bring on a revolution. He has to use the abilities of the proprietarians to do it.
Yeah, I mean, in a simple term, he's not bringing a knife to a gunfight.
But it's also interesting because another big thing that they talk about in the book is the means being the end.
Yeah.
And how this goes completely against that as well. Because he's not justifying. He's trying to justify his means by saying, "I'm trying to bring on this revolution on this planet," but doesn't he like goes against his own thoughts quite a bit?
Yeah, he does. He really does. And he recognizes how uncomfortable it makes him feel as he does it.
Yeah, but he knows that these are tools that he has to use. You know, because otherwise he's bringing a knife to a gunfight. Like, he's being honest. He has his hands open. He comes with hands empty to any given scenario, as he says over and over again. But in this circumstance, there's someone holding a gun to his head, and so he has to do some sort of lying, cheating, and stealing, even though he denies that any of those things can even really exist, unless you let them exist. So he has to bring that to bear. He has to begin to believe that those are things that can be useful and not purely destructive.
Yeah. It gets really interesting because I feel like his philosophy there is not just a we have to play by their rules, but that my rules won't work on them. So like, no matter what, if I continually play by my rules, which is what I want, they will end up using me as their property. So I need to combat that directly.
Yeah, and he definitely starts to realize after that party where he gets really drunk and they kind of manipulate him that way, that he's being kept. He's a creature in a zoo.
Yeah.
In the same way, actually, he compares it to the way that he became Sable's boy on Anares, where he was kept in this single room, so he's away from other people, and he could just write and feed more stuff to this ungrateful, dirty old man. Whereas on Eurus, they do the exact opposite. They, instead of austerity, which is seen as prestigious, on Anares, on Eurus, it's opulence. So they pour all sorts of cash onto him, and in the hopes of bribing him into being possessed more by them, by being able to just feed them new ideas and information.
Did you catch that slight reference right at the beginning where he describes the snow as being excessive on Eurus, like everything else?
Oh yeah, there's just so much moisture; it's falling out of the sky solid.
Yeah, it's just like there's so much snow. Why is there so much snow? This place is excessive.
But then by the end of the scene, he's sliding down the snow ramp with the otter.
Yeah, and having snowball fights with the kid.
Yeah, he gets used to it pretty quickly, and that happens a bunch of times.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I think he talks about when he first comes to Eurus how he's used to only having 2 meals a day,
Yes.
but he still eats the 3 meals, I believe.
Yeah, he tries to. He tries to eat. He tries to do his best so he doesn't embarrass his hosts.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. So I do want to talk about the not Einstein.
Oh, you mean the total Einstein?
You mean the thing that is basically Einstein's name rearranged? Yes.
Well, I totally thought that it was like Guin was referring to it as like, oh, totally not Einstein, until later when you hear the description of the theories that came up under this not Einstein name, and it clearly is Einstein.
Yeah. I had the same thought. I was like, wait, is this Einstein? And then you're like, no, it couldn't be. She wouldn't be that direct. And then she starts talking about the theory of relativity and the way that people talk about the theory of relativity. And
and all the commercial applications that came out of it.
Yeah, there was like a lot of stuff that was real life parallels to Einstein.
So this is interesting because this is one of maybe a handful of instances where things are being consciously translated into the languages of the characters of the book that are not English.
Mm-hmm.
So at one point when Shevek goes to the Terran embassy, Le Guin spells out like phonetically, "Oh my God," when the ambassador sees him all bloody and beat up as he wanders in, and Shevek has no idea what this weird noise means, so he just says his name because that's how you address people on an Ares.
Yeah.
So,
they actually italicized
so
it and everything, and like stuck it all together as one word.
Yeah, because he doesn't speak English.
Yeah.
So then this name that you see as Einstein,
Yeah.
is just like a transliteration, I feel like, of that Einstein name into, as best they can, the languages that are being retranslated back into English for us, the reader.
Yeah, I think it's very similar to the way that English is translated into Japanese, for example.
Yeah. You just add a U on the end.
Yeah, that's one of the things. But yeah, I think it's that very similar to that. But yeah, so I was really...
But when you're translating from non-analogous, what do you call them, alphabets to the like character sets of Asian languages, which are different a little bit.
Yeah, that's fair. Well, we don't actually know what the character set for Pravik or Ioden is.
I think that Pravik is like a completely separate language from...
Yeah,
like,
it's completely made up using logical rules and is the most rational language known to man.
Yeah, so with I got from that they would have like a completely different typeset, like alphabet as well. And I think they mentioned that in the beginning because he has to learn iota and all the different symbols, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. They give him a dictionary.
He has to learn.
He has to puzzle it out.
A dictionary and a book.
Yeah. A really basic philosophy book. So, again, and I know I keep talking about this, but book published in 1974. So, when they're talking about Einstein here, and they're talking about the theory of relativity, she goes on to say that, yeah, not like those guys who start talking about quantum theory, whatever those guys are doing. because that's the technological application. But I found it really interesting because if you look at it, this was published in 1974. Hawking was like starting to get big in 1974. Like that's when he started winning awards, was 1974. Like a lot of awards.
Interesting. So I didn't know that. So you're saying that was a reinforcement of Einstein being now like a thing of the past, which is why it's regarded as so ancient?
A little bit, because you know he does describe it as an ancient alien whom he will never meet because he's been dead for how many years. But I also think it's interesting because from us as modern science people, like people who understand science and understand a lot more than just like your basic high school science, you guys more than me, but you know Hawking's work on string theory and the like a general theory of time and like all that kind of stuff is kind of what Shevek is trying to do in a lot of ways, and is a much more practical application of things past the theory of relativity, at least in my opinion. But Guin wouldn't have had that to reference, is kind of my point. So Einstein was the sort of the peak of the physics world at that point.
Well, I mean, there was quantum physics still like
Yeah.
competing, right? So there were multiple schools of thought, and that's kind of what Einstein was trying to bridge, or not Einstein, what Hawking was trying to bridge.
Yeah.
Is still trying to bridge.
Yeah. Oh, totally. I mean, we haven't come to a solid conclusion yet, but I'm just saying that I find it interesting that this book was written kind of independent of that, and as soon as we start talking about this kind of time stuff, I immediately went to Hawking. Because that's what we're versed in, much more so than Einstein.
Well, what do you mean by versed in?
I mean, arguably in popular parlance.
Oh, I see. Like the idea of string theory.
Yeah.
I think it's, well, from my opinion, I think it's fairly balanced. Like, or I think they've become different things. Like maybe 5 or 10 years ago, string theory was this like wacky science thing that is supposed to explain the universe, and has kind of settled down, at least within pop culture, that I see as like just another thing.
Yeah.
Where the principles of relativity and like the science that comes behind that is proven. Like there are everyday applications of like relativity that work in our lives, and
Yeah.
at least from my point of view, those are fairly like common knowledge, what I would consider, but I don't have any common knowledge about like what string theory has brought on in the world, if it has anything.
I mean, for me, speaking as someone who's not necessarily as involved in the sciences as you are, relativity works on a practical level, but it doesn't work on a cosmological level.
What do you mean by cosmological?
Like-
No, the opposite of that.
Is it? Because I thought the idea was that relativity worked. The relativity worked like when we talk about relativity between us and the way that we interact with the world, but it doesn't work on a quantum physics level.
Right, quantum physics is really tiny bits.
Yeah, exactly.
Like less
Cosmology
than one
is
atom.
really big bits.
Fair enough. That was a improper use of the term.
Yeah. Yeah.
Whereas string theory is really an attempt to bridge both of those schools, and has really popularized the idea of quantum physics and the study of quantum physics a lot more.
I'm not familiar
Yeah,
with that,
so-
but that's a possibility.
So I'll drop the other third reference that I didn't mention in chat, which is the three body problem. Q groans from Brendan. So so the three body problem, which is a Chinese book that's all about science being blocked as a means to an alien invasion. They talk a lot about pure theory science being the best place to block a society because that's where you're least certain about how all the rules interact. So if you can insert a bunch of random information into tests done by someone in like a particle accelerator, for example, so they can't figure out more concretely how the smaller and smaller micro world works, then they can't extract more useful science from that because they can't advance and can't make anything more concrete. And because of course the next step after pure theory is some sort of semi-practical application, and then after that it's applied in a thing that everyone has in their living room or kitchen.
Yeah.
And so in this we're just seeing that theoretical point right before it's disseminated, where it can cross over that threshold to be commonly enough known that it can become a semi-practical thing. With what Shevek talks about is not being able to transport matter instantly, but transport information instantly across any distance. His Ansible.
Yeah.
I wonder if, and this is just a question of mine, if Shevek is supposed to be a slight like allegory to Einstein, where he was primarily a theorist from what I know about him, and like during his time he put out these theories, and just as Shevek explained in the book, like he's just a theorist, he's not an engineer, he doesn't apply these things as like general relativity was applied to create like help satellites and GPS and things like that. I wonder if that's supposed to be kind of an allegory towards Einstein and his theory of relativity at the time.
I think that's perfectly valid. I think their aims were very similar in how they worked. I agree with you about the engineering thing. I mean, Einstein is one of the main people whose science helped the atomic bomb, but he did not have anything to do with the atomic bomb. That was all, how Oppenheimer dealt with it, right? Sam probably knows a lot more about that than I do. But I agree entirely, and I think the inclusion of Einstein so obviously is sort of a hint at that, especially because where Einstein sort of failed, and then he did kind of fail in the ways that they describe in the book in real life, Shevek does not. Like, he kind of learns from Einstein's failure in order to not do that, which I think is really interesting, because he did that in that kind of way of like, stop trying to like have a concrete foundation and just assume that something's going to work and write how it will work. And then eventually it'll all kind of make sense rather than approaching it from like, I need evidence to prove this.
Well, yeah, he kind of tries to do a more scientific method kind of thing. He says, okay, well, this is my theory. I'll put the math down and then I'll compare it to the actual results. And then, well, when it doesn't line up, you try and mold your theory a little bit better so it describes the observable events a little bit better the next time.
Yeah.
Rather than what a lot of the other academics on Aries and on Eurus are doing, because they're so invested in the status quo, is they're saying, well, okay, the universe should behave according to these rules I have, so now I'm going to pick and choose what data I apply to test.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of what Einstein is known for doing, in my opinion. Why he was considered such a genius and such a creative thinker was because he did things like that, and I think Hawking is very much the same way, at least in my opinion.
So what's really interesting about Einstein and the general and specific theories of relativity are that at the time his math was impeccable, but it was 100% unprovable.
Yeah.
He had basically no concrete evidence for it.
Yeah.
And we've just been piling it up ever since. So in that way, yeah, I think maybe Shevek's theories are comparable, because there's nothing for him, no way for him to prove that it's true, because the hardware to test his theories doesn't exist yet.
Because it can't exist without. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And he says that, I'm pretty sure. And when he has that moment of realization that he just needs to do it.
And I think he also talks about that when he goes to like the light lab on Eurus. Like basically saying, these are the people that are going to make the things that come out of my theory.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, he kind of jokes about it at a couple points where he say like, "Yeah, those guys down at the lab, like, they have this Ansible that they want me to make the math for, because once we have the math, we'll be able to make it." He was like, "But I don't know if the math works like that.
So
We
in this
haven't
book,
proven it."
do they have the Ansible,
Well,
or do they not have the Ansible?
so the guys at the Light Lab are working on the concept of the Ansible, but they don't have the physics in order to make it work. So they need Shevek's principle in order to have the proper mathematical equations in physics in order to make the Ansible functional.
See, I thought it was the other way around, where the Ansible was already a thing, and Shevek was more going towards like transilliance of going across space without time.
No, see,
Am I just
I definitely
confused?
interpreted it as sort of like an atomic bomb sort of thing, where like they know they gotta make it, they just need to figure out how to do it.
Yeah, that's how I felt as well. Is the engineers said like, okay, well, there's this thing. We know there's a thing called being able to transmit information instantaneously. We just don't know what numbers to plug in to do it. Like we've got a bunch of hardware and we just kind of got to twist knobs and fiddle dials until it works. But we would have no way of knowing where to twist and where to fiddle without your equations.
Okay, I must have read that wrong.
Yeah, and I'm thinking about it now, and it like I had this weird impression again because I think that IO is very much like a London-esque society.
Yeah.
But I was getting a lot of like sort of Turing vibes from a lot of stuff and like that kind of thing of like testing the Enigma machine and how, you know, if the answer if Shevek didn't give the tech to the Terrans, then the Iodian government would use it like the Turing machine. They would use it as a way to gather information and send their own information and not let anybody else have it.
Right, and yeah, use it to conquer rather than to,
Yeah.
you know, some whatever the word I'm trying to think of, like spread the love.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah, they want to keep that information for the state, for the benefit of the state, and not
to
for
profit.
people.
Yeah, to profit.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because we talked about this a little last time with the Hainish cycle, right? So the Ansible is like the most is the reason this book exists in a lot of ways, because that's the piece of technology that's a really big part of how the other books, like how the society and the other books function. I haven't personally read them, but that's what I've read about them.
So is there faster than light travel in the other books as well?
I don't know.
Okay.
I just know that the Ansible is like a really important step in the Hainish's sort of development, because the other books take place much later.
Well, so that's interesting because at the very end, Shevek talks about the implications of the Ansible, where he says, well, it can be used as a way to not physically, but informationally unite the 9 known worlds.
Mm-hmm.
He says maybe we can make a thing bigger than ourselves. States can stop being such importance because they're so local, and suddenly maybe the planets can kind of be like how states were before. So everything kind of gets zoomed out a little bit.
Yeah, exactly. And I think having the Ansible allows the Hainish as a civilization to rapidly expand in the other books for the other books kind of thing. Because this is a prequel, right? So.
Oh, so you're saying this is like the impetus for them to suddenly go from a kind of ancient stagnant society to a suddenly expanding thing?
Yeah, I think so. The way I interpret it, yeah.
Interesting, because they seem explicitly old and sad in this book. Like they kind of screwed up a long time ago.
Yeah, I was very intrigued by that. But I feel like a lot of those views would probably be explored in the other novels.
I think so. And it's interesting to see the discussion of even how the Hainish talk about themselves. Is like the individuals know their society is old and they live longer than the average person, but even a single one of them has not experienced a tiny fraction of what their civilization could be.
Yeah, I actually really like that answer that he gave, where he's like, yeah, like our civilization has seen anarchy like hundreds of times or whatever, but I have never personally experienced it, and I want to. Because I'm an individual. I'm not defined by my society per se.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it seems
Sorry,
like
go ahead.
that's a theme that kind of like that's
Well,
one of
it's
the themes of the
anarchist.
books, right? Yeah, it's a part of how Shevek, like basically is living his life too, or is trying to. And
Yeah.
I think it's also same thing about not necessarily society as well, but also like where one lives and how on Eurus he was trying not to have where he was living define who he was either.
Yeah. Um, he always had that kind of grass is greener mentality, which was interesting.
You think Shevek did?
Yeah, because I think he spent so much time trying to escape Aneris and escape how they were holding him back, only to go to Eurus and find that they were holding him back in this different ways, but they were still holding him back.
See, I didn't get that kind of portrayal from Shevek of like wanting to escape Eurus, like wanting to sorry, not escape Eurus, escape Aneris. I got the more sense that he was trying to like tear down the walls between Eurus and Aneris, because at the last chapter of Past Shevek, like the last line is basically like, Takfir, what are you talking about? I'm never going to go to Aneris. That's ridiculous.
Yeah, he's like,
And
I'm
how-
never gonna go there. But it's like
Yeah.
the second last chapter where we
Yeah.
know he's been there forever.
Exactly. And like BDAP also says like, I'd rather slit my throat than go to Eurus. So
Yeah.
it doesn't it sounds like the people of Aneris aren't necessarily wanting to like experience Eurus and be on Eurus for any particular reason other than trying to unite the two societies.
Yeah,
And they're realizing that they can't unite the two societies at that point without going, where they tried to do it with the radio contact, it seemed.
right. But Shevak is explicitly not the same as everybody else on Aneris.
Right?
Well, yeah, he
that's-
seems to repeatedly set himself aside from society,
Yeah,
consciously or otherwise. He just feels like he's apart from it, and that feeling of being apart from it makes him materially apart.
interesting.
So like it's kind of this self-feeding process.
I see what you're saying.
But
Sorry, continue.
so, I had a thing that I was going to say and I've forgotten.
Well, you're saying he was materially a part of society when he was constantly putting himself aside.
Oh, no, it wasn't actually to do with that. It was to do with the grass is greener syndrome.
Oh, right.
So I thought the scene where Shevek goes into the Terran embassy was especially interesting
Oh, yeah, definitely.
because of the conversation that he has with the Terran ambassador and the way she keeps kind of being more and more amazed at the things coming out of his mouth.
Yeah.
So
Oh,
he
definitely.
describes to her Eurus as being this hellish nightmare. Like, just there's so much wrong with this place, and everyone's doing everything wrong. We've got things figured out so much better on an Ares, and she just looks at him and like, this place is so much better, so much more alive, and so much freer than anything I've ever known. What the hell kind of crazy ass heaven planet do you come from that this could possibly be hell?
Yeah. She
And
literally
I
says
thought-
that.
Yeah, and so what I thought was most interesting there was the information that we can glean about what the Earth is like. So she describes Earth as having less than 500 million inhabitants, down from the peak of 9 or 10 billion.
Yeah.
And she talks about the ground and the sky being gray. It sounds like a glimpse into what Le Guin is saying, what dystopia Earth is going to be in 1,000, 2,000 years, kind of thing, right?
Yeah,
And
the plastic blowing in the wind that never goes away.
yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
So it was interesting to kind of have this Eurus and Ares society that's somewhat contemporary with us as the reader, but then like our home Earth in this distant future relative to us is demolished by our own decisions. So we're kind of seeing the potential future of Eurus as well,
right.
because we've already learned that one of the main reasons that Eurus trades with an Ares is because there's a huge deficit of particular minerals on Eurus that have been used up during some previous technological boom. Right? So they're already venturing down that excessive consumption route.
Right.
Yeah. Well, I mean, they're a society of excess. They've never been described as anything but a society of excess.
Yeah. So I thought that was interesting. Is that they're kind of presented with this endpoint, and yet they keep going along with it anyway.
Right. Oh yeah, that's an interesting thought that the people of like the Iodian civilization would clearly know the story of the Terrans and not learn anything from it. I think that's I wonder what kind of comment that says about kind of like American society, or let's call it North American society, of being able to see the destruction, and we even see it more these days with climate change, seeing how that affects our Earth, but seemingly not doing anything to prevent what seems like an inevitable future. Like either an arrogance that comes along with that, or a almost like love of like opulence, or like I guess I wonder what Le Guin is trying to say about like North American society by making that kind of comparison between Earth in the book and Eurus.
So I definitely think it's a comment on the short-sightedness of both sides. Where, on Eurus, they've already experienced these resource the way resources have been depleted on their planet to the point where they had to search off-world for imports of these particular materials. The profit that they can garner by manufacturing and selling whatever this thing that requires the scarce input is more important than the consideration down the line that they will use up all of this resource for something trivial. Whereas on an Ares, you see the short-sightedness in as much as every small decision is fine and it's suited for the moment. Every problem that you have where the bureaucracy slowly solidifies and slowly centralizes more power is fine because it solves the problem of the moment. But then when you step back and you look at it across 10 or 20 years, you realize that all of these little tiny short-term decisions have cumulatively created the thing that you were always trying to avoid.
Mm-hmm. I thought it was also actually interesting how they make a bit of a comparison about kind of not it's not excess in this point, but how like during the drought, Shevek never knew what hungry was because he always had something to eat.
Yeah.
And
except for that one time on the train.
Yeah, Anaris had their own kind of excess in a sense that they always had food, and that their society, in a way, wasn't built for famine. Because people are so used to always needing what they need, because they're raised to only take what they need, not excess. But now when they don't have what they need, things start to go awry within their society.
Yeah, I was thinking that too, because when you talk about the drought, like, they didn't have backup stores. Like, they don't have, they're a society that never gets ahead. So like they're never quite have like extra things for later. So if there's a bad winter and things happen, they kind of have to make that up the next year. They don't really have a choice because of the way that their structure is built and the way that their planet is. So yeah, as soon as something bad like a drought happens, they're like completely screwed.
Yeah, they live constantly on that razor's edge of just having enough.
Yeah.
And they explicitly don't want to have more than that because any more than what you absolutely need is excess.
Is excrement.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we're
So
going.
they kind of.
Sorry,
go ahead.
Well, I was going to say
they kind of intentionally screw themselves because they ride that line and they do it so well, such that when their demand exceeds their supply, they aren't able to keep up with it because there was never margin to begin with.
And I think it's a really interesting commentary, and I know we're running out of time, Brendan, but how basically the rules of their society didn't prepare them for the conflict that comes when like a shortage of food comes. How they were talking about like the Shevek coming, I think, back on a train, and how they were basically a half day away from like razing the city that they were stopped in to get food, and how the city wasn't like, and how like foreign of an idea it was to kind of like go against your own society within an Eris. I thought it was really interesting to see that kind of thought process that Guin went through for thinking about like how will a society think that has always worked as a team when they're pitted against each other.
Yeah, that was a very interesting scenario actually. Because it was a town of 150 people, and there were 450 people on the train, and the town was like, the town is not a food town. They don't grow food there. They have to import it all. So like they were like, well, if we give you anything, we don't know when we're getting resupplied, and we don't know how we'll like feed our own people.
And basically everyone gets nothing if we give you something.
Yeah. Because their stores for 150 people are so much smaller than 450 people on the train.
Yeah, I just really like that thought experiment that Guin went through in that, like, as the drought came through Inaris. I think that was a great way to show the flaws of the Inaris society while also trying to show the ideals of, like, oh, everyone's coming together to eat less, and we're giving the people that need the food, like the pregnant women, what they need when they have it. But when things get even tougher, what happens? I really liked, that was one of my favorite parts of the book, is to show how Inaris reacted to the drought.
Yeah, I thought that moment was especially impactful because of exactly what you were talking about, the way they say, like, okay, do the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few? Mm-hmm. And in this decision, you can't absolutely apply that because the many, the 450 on that train, were maybe a day away from food if they just held on, because they would take the train to the next major city and then they could eat there. Or they could take away the rights, like be the tyranny of the majority and have food right now, not enough, but some food, and leave nothing for that smaller segment of the society. So it was, I felt, a question of like, how much democracy do you actually want? Because there can be such a thing as too much.
Mm-hmm.
So their society is not necessarily perfectly democratic. Like, it tries to be fair and equal and equitable, which are all different things, but at the same time, it tries to be at least kind of pseudo-democratic.
But it's not even trying to be democratic in the way, because it's just saying, like, anyone can make any decision, and votes don't, like, they never have votes, right? They have discussions.
Yeah, even when they do.
Yeah, they have votes of, like, okay, here's the general consensus, you can follow it or not.
Yeah. Yeah, so I thought it was interesting in as much as it challenged our idea that that kind of thing has to be democratic, whereas a more kind of social tyranny actually holds sway.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So we're going on 85 minutes.
Yeah.
So, closing thoughts?
Yeah, so now would be the time to talk about anything that you specifically wanted to talk about that hadn't gotten mentioned so far. So we'll go first with you, Lucas.
I think I'm good. I think we sufficiently talked about kind of like the circle metaphors that went through the world. One thing that I really liked about the end of the book with Keto coming onto the world, is I think that really hit home the idea of tearing down the wall, or like poking a hole in the wall that they built up at the very beginning of the book. That bow that they put on at the end, where someone entering the society that no one has entered for 7 or 8 generations. I really liked that ending. I think she did Guin did a great job with tying that circle up.
Yeah, and you know what the best part of that was? It was really that all of humanity is really the same, no matter what planet they're from.
Yeah, they just want to explore their particular freedom.
Yeah. So yeah, any last things that you wanted to discuss, Sam?
Well, I know we discussed a lot of the like content, but I thought the way the book was written was really interesting.
Yeah, it had very interesting language.
Yeah, the language was very descriptive and specific, but it was also very sparse in the places where it was meant to depict sparseness, and very rich in the places where it was meant to depict richness. So there were a lot more adjectives and descriptors when you're on Eurus than when we were on Ares. A lot more gray and dust on an Ares, because that's just what it's like. And so everything gets, the medium becomes the message, I guess is what I'm saying. And that worked very well in this instance.
Yeah, I agree with that. I also thought it was interesting because I kind of feel like that last 6-page chapter kind of did strike a kind of interesting balance between those two sort of setups, because it was supposed to be a balance between the two.
It was kind of that final note to the chord. You have to close it out.
Yeah, I really like the ivities, because there was a lot of them, to describe a vast majority of things.
The what? Sorry, I'm unfamiliar with the word you said.
I said the ivities. So there was like, the sequency, or there's a lot of words that ended with that sort of ty or y ending.
Oh, I see.
To describe things that we wouldn't normally describe that way.
Right.
Which I thought was interesting. There was one near the end where he was talking to Tekfar, where he was saying it was something weird word like isolationicity or something like that, and I was like, huh. But yeah, I think there was a lot of that in the way that their language works.
And I think that's a really interesting way for Le Guin to put emphasis on words within the book. Like, I've put this ending, this suffix at this word, that gives some significance, some emphasis to it.
Yeah.
In whatever context it's being used.
Yeah.
So one last comment before you close out is that I love Le Guin's purposeful use of like excrement and shitstool throughout the book, because from what I've read, it was a specific jab at North American society's uncomfortableness with like excrement and feces. Like, she specifically did that to be like, American society is ridiculous with all the different words they use for like the bathroom. I really liked her like position on that. I thought it was really cool.
That's fair. So the one thing that I liked a lot that we didn't talk about much, but we don't really need to, I really liked the way that Shevek approached art, and the process of doing art. Yes. It was super fascinating as someone who's kind of into that sort of thing, and as someone who comes from a very logical science math background who does art. Like I get it. I get him so much for that, especially because he approaches his science the same way.
Well, you got to quote the quote when he goes into the art gallery, right?
Oh, that was so good.
was
I
really good.
love that sort of. Oh, it was good. It was so good.
Okay, if you're not going to do it, I am. So he goes into the art gallery, and he sees all these paintings, and he's like, okay, well, someone's giving these away because they had to make them. And then the curator starts talking to him and trying to sell him these paintings, and Chev gets super pissed off.
Yeah.
And he says, why were these paintings created? Like, you can't, this is unsellable. A man makes art because he has to.
Yeah. He says that.
And it seemed like such a summary of exactly why he's doing everything he's doing. It's not because he should or because it achieves a particular goal, because it's the thing that he has to do. It's the thing he's compelled to do.
Well, I think there's a very big parallel drawn between him doing physics and someone creating art. I think that's...
Yeah.
I don't even think that's a question. I think that's something that was purposely done.
Definitely.
And I love it. I love everything about that because I feel that on a day-to-day basis. The way that he approaches it. So I love that. And I'm not going to get too much more into that for now. But yeah.
No, I just thought that was an important point to make that I can't believe we'd forgotten to make.
Yeah.
Definitely.
So yeah. I guess we'll round it out with, did you like the book? And then we'll close out.
Well, I know for one that I enjoyed this book tremendously. I like any book that has that kind of philosophical bent to it, but at the same time manages to bend that back around to be relevant to kind of the real world.
Yeah.
I'm on the fence with the book. I feel like there are a lot of scenes that could have been taken out, and that some of the soliloquies could have been cut down. Like, to be honest, the Terran embassy scene, I feel like could have been cut in half. As much as a lot of the themes of the book come out, I feel like a lot of them were restatements of what happened. More or less, like I'm glad to have read the book, and I think I got a lot of cool and interesting different points of view. I'm interested to read her other work in this series, but I wouldn't necessarily recommend someone to read this book before reading another part of the series.
Yeah, so the one that's really big in this series is The Left Hand of Darkness, which is the other one that Ursula K. Guin won a lot of awards for. Because this got like a lot of awards, this book.
And some specific non-sci-fi awards.
Yeah, because
like
it's
the
very
Hugo
literary.
Award?
Well, the Hugo is a sci-fi award. But...
Okay, and what was the other one? There's another one that was big.
It's the Hugo, the Nebula, the World Fantasy Award, and the National Book Award that are just on the cover of the book.
Yeah. Which are all
Right.
very prestigious awards. But the National Book Award is a literary book award.
Yeah, that's not something that they just give out to any random science fiction or almost any science fiction book, period.
Yeah, it's pretty rare.
What about you, Brendan? What was your thoughts on the book?
So I'm in the middle of both of you. I was on the fence for a long time about this book because there were so many moments where I was just bored out of my mind, only to be pulled up into a very, very high peak immediately after. And a lot of that had to do with there were some of the philosophical debates I was really into, and some of them I just was like, oh, again? Or he just was saying it in such a way that was so academic that I just wasn't interested or glossed over. You know what I mean?
Definitely. Yeah, I had the same feeling. I think that's what I was trying to describe.
But then he'd go and he'd say it in this really cool metaphor, and you'd just be like, oh my God, you're brilliant.
Like how he describes music, and you're like,
yeah,
exactly. And then they talk about a whole chapter about a drought, and some of the things you're like, I get it, it's tough.
Yeah,
Can
exactly.
we move on to what's happening on Eurus?
But I
Eurus
agree
was
with
kind
you
of
that
exciting.
I think this book is something that you read and it changes you, whether you liked it or not, because it's filled with so much stuff. about so many topics, which is why it was considered a literary work and not just a science fiction novel. So I liked it. I didn't love it, but there were moments in it that I think have probably changed me as a writer forever. So, yeah.
I think that's a good description. I liked it, didn't love it. But I loved parts of it.
Yeah, I did. I loved a lot of parts of it, and I think there's a lot you can take. Like, I think for someone who's studying writing, like if I had shown this to the younger me, like I would have gotten so much out of this in taking steps towards being a better writer. As it is, I've learned a lot of that stuff, so I see it and I can recognize its skillfulness and the way that it's been done. But there's still lots more that I can take out of that professionally. So yeah, because I approach everything as it relates to me in writing. So yeah, we're gonna close out now, Sam.
Yeah, so I guess before we go to the full closeout, I want to go to, does anyone have any plugs, any shout-outs?
I don't think Lucas does, because he's not on the internet.
I'm Lucas. I don't live on the internet. So
Okay.
no plugs for me. But I really appreciate you guys having me on. It was fun to talk about a book.
Yeah,
I
man.
don't think I have done this for like 8 years. So it was really interesting to take a more critical view on a book and to be able to discuss kind of the bigger points.
Yeah, man. We loved having you. Awesome. We love the discussion we're having. We plan on having you back at some point. We're not sure when that will be. But
possibly. I'll probably need a little bit more time to read a book. It felt like I was in university, but like, oh God, I gotta say something smart about something.
Well, I'm not gonna lie. I started reading chapter 7 this morning.
Jesus.
And I got it done, so we got there.
Well,
but
it
yeah,
took me two weeks to read, so
yeah,
give me a heads up so I can read a book like way in advance, and I'll be good.
Yeah, it won't be for a few months.
Counterpoint, I figured I finished this 2 weeks ago.
But me and Sam have been discussing possibly changing up the timing of the episodes to make it easier for people to do that. We're still talking about it. We'll see how it goes. But yeah, we'd love to have you back is kind of the gist. So
cool.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
On the Read Write All-Stars episode.
Yeah. So as for me, plugs, you're on my channel right now. I will see you guys next Wednesday, 12 p.m. Eastern. And then next Monday at 12 p.m. Eastern, I'm having my 1-year anniversary stream where I'll be doing my first gaming stream. And we're going to be playing Telltale the Batman game.
Cool.
Yeah.
I am Batman.
I started playing the Minecraft one today. It's actually amazing. It's actually
fantastic. That doesn't
fantastic.
even make sense.
It's really good. It's got crafting in it and everything, using the recipes from the game. It's so good. It's so good.
Are there mines too?
Yeah, there's mines.
Good. We got all the ingredients, 100%.
So yeah, anything you need to plug?
Yeah, the only thing that I was gonna give a shout out to was a book that's like ancient at this point, but I've just been reading Patrick Rothfuss's The Name of the Wind.
Oh yes.
And
I'm just about to start that.
It's so good, Lucas.
Read the hell out of it.
It's so good.
Strangely, this is also the first book that I've used Amazon's WhisperSync on, so like I can read it on my Kindle and then just load up the audiobook, which is heavily discounted. I'm being paid by Amazon, I wish. And so yeah, you can load up the audiobook and it just starts at the same spot, and when you stop that, you just pick up the ebook and it's in the same spot.
That sounds amazing. Like I want to try it.
It's not as easy as it sounds, but it's awesome when it works.
Yeah.
So yeah, so I thought that was pretty great.
Yeah.
And Patrick Rothfuss is an amazing author.
He is. He's really good. He went through so many drafts of that book. He wrote it for so long.
Well, no kidding. It's like amazing. It's Harry Potter, but good.
Yeah. So in 2 weeks, we're still doing 2 weeks, right, Sam?
Yep.
Yeah. So that
2 weeks.
That will be
the
May.
8th of May.
Yeah, May 8th. We're going to be reading Glenn Cook's The Black Company, which is a weird military fantasy book, which should be interesting. I'm really excited to try it because I kind of like that kind of thing. But yeah, it's come well recommended to us.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So
on that note, as all our shout outs and all our updates are out, I think that's going to pretty much be it for us here at Read Write Book Club. So I've been Sam, aka MC Pepper Pockets, who you can find at MC Pepper Pockets on Twitter, or at www.burialatsea.com for me blog and all the terrible updates that I put on there.
Yep.
And
I'm Brendan. Follow me here on Accidental Origin and at Freak Lab Mishap on Twitter. Thanks for coming, guys. Lucas?
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm Lucas. You'll probably see me sometime in the future here. Maybe at that point I'll have a magical Twitch or a magical Twitter. Who knows?
We'll see how it goes.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks for coming,
don't keep
guys.
yourself pure.
Sam hates me on Twitter.
It's terrible and I love it. Oh God, kill me now.
But yeah,
All right, so goodbye, beautiful viewers. I think this is the end.
this is the
See
end.
ya.
See you.